here first. You can ask any questions if you like, and you can put them in the text chat box, and I will answer them as best I can. If I don't know the answer, as I always tell people, if I don't know everything, but if I don't know the answer, I will certainly get back with you. I'll email you back if you give me your email, or I can send you additional information. And after today's session, I will share a few documents that can be helpful in planning a digital libraries project. Some documents I've worked on, and I've got a lot of best practices because I've worked on these kind of projects in several different through several different lenses now. The one I'm working on now is a system migration, so I'm working more with the data migration. That's always exciting. So we're going to be talking a lot more about all of that, and also talking a little bit about best practices and also the kind of software that's out there. So I'll try to give you a good sense of pros and cons and a little bit more information. We can kind of go through this pretty quickly. I think most of the people who attend these probably are very familiar with the Adobe Connect by now, but I always throw the slide in here just in case somebody needs a little reminder. If for some reason, I was telling Carol Ann I had been sick a little bit earlier, if for some reason my voice goes away, just let me know in the text chat box, because it may be actually my voice has gone away as opposed to just the sounds dropped or something. So you can let me know in the text chat box. Just a little bit about me. I've been doing digital library stuff for not a long time, but quite a while now. I worked on several early repository projects, institutional repository projects. So I've done project planning. I've done software evaluation. More recently, I did work on a big consortial digital library institutional repository project, and I'll actually talk about that, show some screenshots in that as we go along, and really came to digital libraries and institutional repositories because I have a cataloging background. I started out as actually started in public services a long time ago as a student worker, but then I migrated to technical services and migrated to cataloging because I like the data part of it. But the other part of it is I was sort of, the web was really at the early 2000s was really just starting to take off, and we had, Facebook in 2006, but even before that we had Yahoo and Google and all these things that were coming along, and digital libraries were really starting to look, I would say, around the 2000s, but earlier even, because I do know of earlier projects in that we're starting to look at the materials that they have, especially special collections materials, and how they could share those online and what they could do with those materials to provide access to them. And so I think that was really one of the things that I loved about working with digital library materials and institutional repository types of projects is this sort of connection between the metadata and the cataloging part of it that I love so much, and then also the web technology and the technology component of it. So, I feel like it's a really natural fit for me when I get to work on those projects. And also my mom is a certified genealogist, and I've been all over, well, I wouldn't say all over the United States, but I've been over many areas, especially of the Southeast, helping my mom dig around and look at various things. And so, it really does include that sort of stuff too, the special collection sorts of stuff. So hi, Lori, welcome. I was just telling everyone a little, well, actually you and Jesse, a little bit about myself and what my area of expertise is. And actually I grew up in Florida, so I have a Florida connection as well, and I still have family who lives there, and I'm usually there just about at least once a year for the holidays, if not a little bit longer than that. So right now I am a manager of technical services, and I'm helping a system go through system migration. So that's been an interesting process. If you'll tell me though, if you have a moment, or if you have a thought, you may not have anything on top of your head, just sort of on top of your brain that you really need to know, but if there's anything that you would like to talk about, or anything about digital libraries, if you're working on a digital library project, or you're looking at how you can, maybe you need to migrate or you want to move to a different kind of software, or if you've recently migrated to a different kind of software. If you have anything like that that you'd like to talk about, we can certainly talk about those sorts of things because, like I said, I've worked on a lot of different projects now. You see my little tiny yearbook scan up there. We did not, I will say for that particular project, we did not scan the yearbooks. The yearbooks were the actual scanning of them was done by a company. If you are interested in scanning support, I can refer you to a few different companies that I know of that do good work. I will say this because for this particular project with the yearbook and my little screenshot there over in the corner, those yearbooks were for a technical college from the late 60s. They actually start in the mid 60s and then they go up through about the mid 70s. And the quality of the publications are just not as, I mean, even though they were commercially published, they're locally published and, locally printed and that kind of thing. So I would say this was probably a little bit challenging materials, although they are commercially published, because some of the images weren't very good in terms of the photographs that were used to begin with. But then on top of that, of course, the age of the materials, and we did, because in some cases the only copy we had of these yearbooks was the one copy that was in special collections. And Lori, you being a digitization person, you you probably well understand that you don't want to take something apart to scan and digitize it. So we had some we had some things to deal with, and the company was great to work with, but I just don't think our scans quite turned out as cleanly as they might have otherwise. So anyway, that was I just wanted to kind of note that as we were looking at it. So what we're going to talk about today, some software choices, a little bit about where we are in terms of digital library stuff. I'll just kind of hit on some of the biggies in terms of software choices and pros and cons them a little bit. I have a really nice, it is from 2014-15 document that's like a pros, cons spreadsheet thing. And I haven't updated it recently because I haven't been through this process again of having to evaluate software. However, I'm certainly willing to share it. The information on there in some cases may be a little bit outdated, but it's still relevant. But I think it gives you a good idea if you're looking at comparing software, sort of what I looked at and how I took all that information that was on all those different websites and information I got from vendors and stuff, and how I kind of put it into a usable sort of matrix that I could work with. So certainly feel free to take my document. It's a Google Doc. It's publicly available, and like I said, I'll share the link. And feel free to take it and repurpose it and use it for your own, because it was done as part of a grant project, so it is released under open rights. So if you want to cite me or give me some credit, that's awesome, but it really is part of a grant project, so it's freely available in that way. So we'll talk about some of the resources that are out there. I'm going to talk about it both from a project management standpoint, and then we'll talk a little bit, we'll kind of get in the trenches just a little bit, and then a lot of best practices. I'm going to talk a little bit more about rights management, and actually I do talk about accessibility, but I realize I don't have accessibility on my list. So I want to talk a little tiny bit about accessibility because I think we just sometimes in libraries don't talk about that enough. So we'll touch on that as well. And then we're going to talk about some best practices for metadata support. How do you get your information cataloged? How do you get it to show up in Google, all that stuff. Interoperability, getting rid of those silos. We always talk about silos. How are we what can we do from a digital library standpoint to get rid of those silos or reduce those silos, reduce those barriers? So I'll talk a little bit about that. Do want to also touch just briefly about the intersection between digital libraries and cataloging, because as a person who's been sort of on both sides of this, I think sometimes we just kind of forget there's this group of people that can help. Sometimes depends on how big your library is, and I do think many libraries. I see Lori's with this great title. I I do think many libraries are starting to kind of look at it in the broad spectrum and kind of think about it. So I kind of love this little diagram. This comes from the Dublin Core, DC, Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. And what I love about this is that it just kind of shows like this flow of like information and stuff. And we got all this stuff. And so we've got home pages out on the web. We've got scientific data. And I think we forget, I mean, I forget about scientific data. I mean, I have friends who are scientists who are doing scientific data. And, I think we kind of, it's one of those things, unless you're doing it or you need it, like some of the things that have been on the governmental websites that have, moved or they've been taken down temporarily or whatever it may be, until you need that information for some reason. I think sometimes we kind of forget that scientific data exists and it's a big bucket of data that's out there. And it is. And I do know libraries who are actually archiving some of their researchers' data. That can be a huge strain, though, on resources in terms of server space and stuff like that. But I do think it's a really interesting, kind of thinking about this library serving as an archive and you have the Internet Archive out there who's archiving web space and stuff like that. But it's really kind of up to these institutions, and I think a lot of times the scientific data is archived at that larger institutional level, but sort of how does libraries fit into that, or where do we fit into that space, or do we kind of step up and say, we'll help archive some of the scientific data if we can, if it's not under some kind of copyright, or if it's not it doesn't need to be embargoed for some, for patents or whatever it might be. I think the other part of that too is, just thinking about like things we put into an institutional repository. Those differ sometimes from a digital library in the fact that, and I think that's one of the things to me that's the most interesting about these sorts of projects is they get to be really sort of a hodgepodge sometimes. And it's like, oh, well, we started with an institutional repository and we were collecting faculty papers and committee reports and other things that people on campus were doing. And then we decided we wanted to we have local authors who are publishing things. And then we decided we wanted to include our local authors and create a local author collection. Or we decided we wanted to start scanning our yearbooks, and that would be a great place to put them. Or, once people see the software and kind of realize the potential of it, I think they start seeing there's a lot more stuff out there that we could add to it. And so the digital library's institutional repository space just gets kind of all rolled into one common space sometimes. So I love this and the fact that it just shows this flow of data and flow of information. Of course, the other part of it is the museum space. Some libraries and if you're special collections, you may work more closely with the museums or not. It just really depends. I think as we become more global in our thinking in terms of what libraries are doing in terms of archiving things and digitizing materials and how we are part of the community and things like that, especially in the academic library. But because I think that's traditionally has not been a place that academic libraries have been as strong as those of you in public libraries. I think in the public library, you've probably had that you have a very tight connection with the larger broad community. Whereas I think academic libraries, and understandably, we have a tendency to kind of look at our campus and the people on that campus and sometimes go beyond that. And we do outreach and things like that, but I don't think we're as tightly tied into the community, maybe as public libraries. But there's always those opportunities that overlap between the various institutions. The other thing that happens, and I think as we go through and sort of look at some of the software and talk about it, I think one of the other things that happens with digital library software is you see different institutions and organizations that are doing so much of the same kind of work, but using different software and using maybe a different metadata schema. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. And it's that they have the same vision. We have this material that we want to put on the web and to make publicly available for people. or we have this material that we want to put into a space that is, internal for our staff or whatever, but they're building that archive, they're building that digital collection. And although, they may not, uh, in addition to museums and libraries and commercial websites, businesses, things like that, that are building information and that are collecting information, you also have groups, a lot of nonprofit groups that will, create and digitize and things like that. One of the earliest web projects I worked on, and this was even before, really at the beginning of like the digital library software development, stuff like that, was a nonprofit that was looking for a way to manage their policies and procedures. But they didn't want just like a policy and procedures manual. They also wanted to be able to have like resource lists and a discussion board and all of those pieces of it. So it was a website, but within that website then was this library of resources, sort of like what you have with SEFLIN and some of these other organizations where you have that library of resources within. So there's lots of places where we're creating digital content and that we're sharing digital content. And I did want to talk just a little tiny bit about that overlap between museums and special collections and digital libraries, because there is so much intersection there. I do think that from a cataloging standpoint, from a traditional sort of print-minded cataloging standpoint, and I will say that's sort of outdated thinking to even think about it as sort of that print mindset, that print cataloging, make a mark record kind of thing. But there's still a lot of that happening because libraries we haven't gotten rid of all our print, and we certainly wouldn't get rid of all our print. We have a lot of, in fact, I have a James Fenimore item we've just found when I was doing some searching that is a first edition kind of thing that we're going to look at and see is it truly a first edition, as the record seems to indicate, and if so, we need to look at it a little bit closer. So, there are those things in our collection. In some cases, they may just have been cataloged for the general stacks. They may not have been even put in this case, not even put into special collections, but they're things to be evaluated and looked at and things like that. Catalogers do, of course, work with those print materials, but more and more we are working with electronic resources as well. And I think one of the things that is becoming more and more common for many of us is that we're cataloging from a surrogate of some kind. So if you have a photograph that you're going to digitize, you're going to catalog from that scanned image. You may not actually have the photograph in front of you. You may, in some cases, not even have access to that original photograph. All you may have is that digitized, digitized image. So I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me about digital library projects and digital libraries is sometimes it's a real mix of a different variety of people who are working on these projects. And I think that's what's both interesting, and sometimes it can be a little bit just overwhelming to kind of figure out like what skills do people have, and what is their piece in this, and all of that kind of thing. So hopefully I'll give you some good thoughts in terms of the kinds of, if you can choose, we're going to talk about resources in a few minutes, but if you can choose to kind of pick your team or pick the people who are working on these kinds of projects, what kinds of people should you pick to be on that dream team? And I would definitely say having someone with that cataloging experience, if you have access to someone who has a broad cataloging metadata background, who's worked on both digital projects and print projects, that's an awesome person to have on your team, even at the planning stage. Because at the planning stage, they will be able to actually give you some feedback on some of the software that you may be looking at. I mean, they may look at it and go, well, this just doesn't have we really do want to have a title, and we really do want to be able to say what year this was done, or whatever it may be. So they may really be able to give you some feedback on the software, in addition to what goes in this field kind of stuff. So I think that's one of the things that is really sometimes overlooked in planning digital library projects. Sometimes they can just they can start either, if you have a digital library department or special collections department or library, sometimes they'll start there. Sometimes they'll be the administrator or the director who comes to you and says, we need to digitize this stuff. And that's sort of how it starts. I've been part of that project too. You can also, sometimes it may be that it starts in the systems or IT department, really starts in the systems or IT department, because the director talks to the head of IT and says, I want this stuff on the web. And that sort of starts the ball rolling then. So it can start in a lot of different places. And I think sometimes the cataloging or whoever's going to be potentially involved in cataloging, doing the metadata work, describing the item, I think sometimes they're not brought in till sort of it's ready to go live. At that point, I think you've kind of missed some opportunities if you've not at least talked to them ahead of time and gotten some feedback. I don't know that, if you have a committee or group or team or whatever, I don't know that they necessarily need to be part of that. But if they have time and you can have them be part of that, I think that's a really important, insightful thing. I'm working on a migration project right now, and the cataloging group, those of us in the cataloging group who've been talking about, how we're going, what should our metadata be? How is it going to work? How are we going to work in this shared system kind of thing? Who've been talking more like policy sort of thing, have had, I think, really important feedback on the public display side of it. We've had a lot of, we've been able to share a lot of information about how information from a MARC record, you know, where that information comes from and why those fields do the things they do. And I think we've also been able to explain why some of that information is so important on a searching standpoint. So I think they can be very valuable. And we've even had discussions about fonts and stuff. So, you know, it's been interesting, but it just kind of has made me think a little bit more about, it does make sense to have someone with that experience or expertise, even at that, sort of cross functionality, areas. We have more and more people being cross trained these days and things like that, but which I think can be very useful in terms of providing insight into how work's done and things like that. But sometimes I think, like I said, the catalogers are kind of just brought in towards the end to kind of like help start cataloging the stuff and getting it ready to go and things like that. But there's a lot of opportunity ahead of time. Certainly programmers, and the thing is, I think one of the things that sometimes another piece that sometimes people, it's like, oh, well, this person is they're a great web programmer or they're great systems. I mean, I know some awesome systems librarians that are just amazing. And I know some awesome programmers that are just amazing. So those people have that kind of expertise. And I think sometimes there's the assumption of, well, they can just load the records. And I've hit that a couple of times where it's like, oh, well, you can just take this batch of JPEGs that have, scanned photographs and you can just load them, or somebody will just load them. And it's like, well, that's not quite all it's going to take. So, I think sometimes being able and hopefully kind of talking through some of the best practices and things to think about as you're developing these projects will kind of help you, maybe not only in terms of project planning going forward, but also maybe if you're looking at ways to make your workflows more efficient or ways that you can reach out and get some help. Work is very similar across a lot of different disciplines for this kind of work. We see, people are creating, I say everybody creates metadata now. If you do a Facebook post, if you write a blog post, if you tag something, if you tag a friend, if you put something on Flickr or Facebook and you add a title or date, or you let it keep your GIS information from your phone, any of that kind of stuff, that's all creating metadata. We may not actually be, coding it and writing the metadata, but everybody's doing it. And so that provides opportunities and challenges as well. So looking to the software, open source, commercial, or freemium. And freemium, I'm not sure if everybody, and this is one of these words where sometimes it's kind of in vogue, it seems, and other times it's not in vogue. But freemium is, they used to call it shareware sometimes as well. If you were back in the day, earlier days of software, I'm sure there'll be another. Well, and sometimes you're pay to play and things like that. But freemium, shareware, pay to play, all those sorts of things, kind of all the same. To some extent or another, you have to purchase something. Now, it may be that you can use the software and do everything you need to do, and you don't need to purchase anything. Um, WordPress can be a good example of that. You know, many people create a website or a blog using WordPress and they don't buy anything. You know, they go to the site. Well, they have to buy their server space and all that kind of stuff, but that's a separate but related cost. The actual software is not costing them anything. And other people may want to do something different in WordPress, or maybe they see a theme. That's what always gets me in WordPress. I'm like, oh, that theme's so nice. I love how that theme looks. Oh, that's $29. Oh, that's $49. All right, let me see what I can do for free. But that's one of those things of, you may find that there are things in the software that you're looking for that may cost extra money. So even if something is open source, that doesn't mean that there's not cost associated with it. It could, of course, there's the hidden cost, staff time, hardware, certainly any resources any software that you would need to support those open source products. If you need more server space, if you need any server space, if you needed a domain, any of that kind of stuff is going to cost you. So I think that's one of the things with open source. People are becoming more aware that it's not completely free. So everybody always says free like kittens or free like puppies. You get one and then you realize how much it's going to cost you with all the vet and the food and the dog toys and all that kind of stuff. So, I think that's one of the things that we do see with open source is that there are those costs that are hidden costs. And I think it's sort of acknowledging them ahead of time as you're developing a plan or thinking about a plan is a good idea, because especially if you're working in, perhaps in the corporate world it's a little bit different, but if you're working in a library, sometimes it's easy to look at staff time. We just see it as like, oh, that person has some time, they can work on this project. Or, oh, that person needs something to do, they can work on this project. Or, um, you know, oh yeah, they can help out or whatever. And before you know it, then, you know, that time, it really is time is money kind of thing. So there's those hidden costs in addition to you may want it to do something that you may need a plug-in, so you may need that little extra piece of software to do something, and that may cost you. Or the other option with open source is that you have staff who can develop those things that you might want. So if you want that fancy theme, you can pay the $29, or you can possibly have some of your staff, should they have the expertise, to develop it. The other thing with buying software, especially for libraries and institutions, is we have to be very careful about the terms of usage and make sure that we don't violate them if we are buying something. If you're buying, there is commercial software out there for repositories, and I talked a little bit about Aquella, but I didn't get any screenshots from it. And I forgot to put those in. But anyway, Aquella is a product from Pearson that is a very large repository system. It works with Dspace or Dublin Core as the metadata schema. You see it if you know the Florida Grove website. That is an Aquella website. NC Live in North Carolina is an Aquella website. If you want to know more about Aquella in detail, my information may be a little bit out of date because it's been a little while since I've talked to anyone from Pearson about Aquella, but at the time that I saw it and spent some time testing it, it's a very robust system and it does a lot. It has some real pros and cons to it. It works with a lot of learning management systems like Blackboard and things like that. It can certainly work as a good support for faculty content, to get content from faculty and things like that. So if you want to know more about Aquella, I can talk a little bit more about that in detail, but I wanted to kind of hit on the biggies. So I kind of picked out 4 of the biggies down here, but I am going to kind of chit chat through all of them as we go through. I put this is my favorite little graphic in the whole entire world when it has to do with project management, because this is the heart of any project that you do. And it doesn't matter if you're going to the grocery store, if you're planning a family reunion, or if you're going to build a new library, or you're going to launch a digital library. These 3 parameters are going to impact whatever you do. You can have it fast, you can have it good, and you can have it cheap. And there's that triangle there that happens. And once you start, and it has to be an equilateral triangle, which means of course, all sides have to be even. So if you squish one side, if you decide, you know what, this has got to be faster than fast, it's got to be done ASAP, like yesterday, then you're going to have to figure out how you're going to keep that triangle. What is going to give on the other side? Are you going to sacrifice quality, or are you going to outsource and get some help and pay more? Let's say you decide that we don't have any money. We have no budget for anything. We're going to use someone at the circulation desk was taking a web design class. So that person's going to help us. And we have some volunteers who are going to digitize some stuff for us. And, so it's going to be cheap. We're going, we have no budget. I've worked on those projects. The no budget, 0 project. When you have things that have a very low budget, that little section of your triangle is tiny, itsy bitsy. That means the fast and good are probably going, well, at least to get the good, the fast is going to have to become much longer. In other words, it's not going to happen quickly. The other thing that may sacrifice when you are looking at, we have no money for this, is you may have to look at the quality. So the quality, I would say if you have no money, you have a tendency to sacrifice either fast. So we do it very slowly because we're not hiring anybody to do it. So they're going to take the time, and if they need to learn web design, or they need to learn systems work, or they need to learn how to digitize, we're going to send them to the Library of Congress, or we're going to do this, or they're going to watch webinars, or use lynda.com, or go to SEFLIN and other classes to learn this stuff. Well, then that will very much impact how fast it's going to be. And I think certainly we see this in libraries sometimes, where we just don't have, we're always on a shoestring budget, it seems like. And so sometimes it takes things a little bit longer to happen. The other part of it is that if you want it to be good, and I think most of us do, but if you want it to be good, then, and you have 0 budget, you are going to have to build in time for people to do development work, or for people to build things, or for people to learn how to do things. So you're fast, especially if you can't sacrifice on the quality and you have no money, then the only place you're going to be able to equal out is your distance of how long it's going to take to do it. Of course, the nice balanced approach is to sort of make it equally, we're going to have a reasonable project deadline. We are going to have a reasonable expectation for what is a good quality product. And we're not going to try to spend huge buckets of money, and we'll use the resources we have. But if we need to outsource or buy something, we will. So the other thing to point out is that less good doesn't always mean poor quality. I mean, I think a lot of times in terms of data, it does, especially for digital library projects. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that quality control aspect as we go along. But it can also mean less functionality. So it may be that you use something out of the box and you don't really change how it looks. You don't build anything different. It just is. And so I think you do see this quite a bit with projects. So anyway, that kind of gets us sort of thinking then. We're going to do project planning a little bit, and then we're going to get more into the software itself, because I do want to spend quite a bit of time looking at the software. So kind of put together, this is a little project plan overview. I've used this in some iteration many times now. So the first thing is to do some project planning. I think one of the most effective things you can do is identify who your stakeholders are, those initial stakeholders that are going to help drive this project and get it off the ground. You may have different stakeholders as you go forward. You know, once you get into software testing and training and you start talking about design and stuff, those may be different people. It would be good if the people who are involved with that part have at least heard of the project, like, oh, we're going to be working on this project. But those may very well be different from those early implementation team kind of people. You know, who do we need to get this started? And if you're in a small shop, it may just be you and, you know, it could be you and your dean, you and your, you know, if you have a library board situation, whoever it is who's going to help you in terms of helping you with the resources. So that whoever's going to help you with the resources, especially the person who holds the pocketbook, that is the person that is, you know, that they're very important people to at least be involved as being one of those stakeholders there from the beginning. Then once you kind of figure out like, okay, who is going to be involved, and it may depend on your library, it may involve some volunteers, or it may be things where, you know, we're also different in terms of library structures. I mean, some are very hierarchical, some are very committee oriented, very democratic. Just sort of open up a committee, whoever wants to be on it, volunteers, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. Sometimes people involve the community in what they're doing. You know, they'll try to pull people in from outside. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. But once you kind of identify like who are the key people that we need to get this started, if these people are not on board, this project's not going to be successful. A lot of times that's the administrator, whoever would be making those decisions about, you know, this is a priority to our library. This is a priority to our institution. Obviously, that's one of the stakeholders, that administrative component, whoever that person is, whatever their title is, the person who has the financial, the keys to the vault, who can help you if you need, you know, perhaps may not actually be able to give you much in the way of money, but can perhaps help you with grants or can help you identify other people you can work with. But yes, whoever that person is as well. Once you get past that sort of initial planning stage of what do you want to do, you know, when we're going to talk more about the what do you want to do in a minute, but the what do you want to do and who is important to make that project happen. At that point, then you can start moving on. You know, you've got your team in place, that initial team, and then you can move on to starting to talk about software analysis and review. This can go quickly or it can take a while. It really depends upon a few different things, including whether or not you have any money to buy anything or any money for help. Uh, if you don't have any money from help and you don't have any money to buy anything, then that's going to really impact what choices you have in terms of software. So getting a lay of the landscape in that project planning stage, and I'm going to talk more about that project planning stage right after this, but getting more of a lay of the land of what's resources available to you, what support you actually have to do this project, what do you want this project to accomplish, those very basic project planning parts of it. Once you get that identified, that's going to give you won't really give you a map, but it'll give you a direction to head in terms of the software. So you won't just have to go out there. I mean, if you know straight up, our budget is going to be very small, so I don't want to spend a lot of, I don't want to spend a lot, if any, money on software. Then you're going to probably not spend a lot of time talking to Pearson or some of these other companies out there. If you are at a, um, if you're working for a institution and you have a grant and you have money, then you're going to spend more time for that. So you're going to just kind of go through that process and kind of think about that. And I'm not going to go all through all the pieces of this because I do want to spend more time talking about the software itself. But you are going to want to just kind of go through these, and you'll have the slides. So this is just something as you're planning a project, things to think about as you move forward. Because this, honestly, these are coming from my very practical. I've been on this, done these projects so many times. The other big part of it, and like I said, the software analysis may take a while. The software review, going out there, seeing what's out there and figuring out if it meets your needs. And we're going to talk about how you know it meets your needs. But that can be happening. In fact, you may have a IT person or web development person or whoever. You may have just one person who's going out looking at software. They may go to, they may go to your library association conference. They may go to AL, wherever they're going. They may just lurk on some list, whatever. But they're out there kind of gathering ideas and figuring out what might work. They don't have to make a decision. They're just out there seeing what's out there, kind of like what you're doing today. The other part of it then is resource analysis, and that gets to the, once we start looking at software, what is it going to require? Do we have the resources to support it? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then you're going to do the old alpha beta or perpetual beta, as some of us I think we may be in, where you're going to do your installation, that sort of first installation. Hopefully it will go well. You just never know what kind of virus protection, spam filters, server protection, whatever the IT person, IT department, system admin, whoever it may be, you just never know what may be in place that may impact these sorts of projects. But anyway, hopefully it'll go well. And hopefully you've talked to that person and said, we're thinking about doing this. Do you see any barriers? And if it all goes well and you get it installed, of course, then there's the whole, at least initially, you don't have to design it at the beginning, but you may want to go ahead and start playing with it to see what you can do with it, to see whether or not it is customizable and to what extent. Certainly, you'll need to do some basic configuration. Whoever's setting up the software, you'll need to set up some user accounts. You may set up user roles so you can test that, or you may just say, well, you know what, we're going to kind of let everybody do everything in here because this is not going to be the live real thing. This is just sort of a sandbox for us to play in. So you may just kind of set something up and let people play in it and see. I think at this point you can also go ahead and start talking about branding. What are we going to call this? Oh my gosh, you would just not believe how complex, especially the more people are involved. What you're going to call this little Georgia e-resources archives and repository. Oh my goodness, it had to spell gear because this was part of the project that was supporting this was a grant that was coming to fund educational resources, and one of the programs that was supporting this was engineering. So they really wanted it to spell gear. And what was that E going to be? So, those sorts of things can be really important. So as you're, I think pretty early on, if you can kind of get the word out that you're working on this, and if you don't have a name, you may have a name that somebody has already picked out, like gear, and you just have to make the letters fit. But that may take a while too. That can be a whole separate group of people. They don't have to be involved in software testing or anything, but I think it's never too early to start thinking about what you're going to call that thing. Because the minute you install that software, you have given it some sort of name in the process of setting it up. Of course, if you have people who are training, if you parse out training to a lot of different people, they're going to need, or training, they're testing, they're going to need some training. If you're doing the testing yourself, you may need to go out and watch some webinars and things like that and to find out how it actually works. It all works, I think it works very similar but different, and we're going to look at sort of the process, how some of the process. Once you get to the point where you feel like you get a handle on like this is how it works, seems to be the best way to upload an item, the best way to batch load something, then you're going to want to start thinking just a little bit at some point. And this doesn't have to be you. It could be you. You could be doing all of these things. Or it may be that, you have a group or people to help you and things like that. You're going to want to think about what your process is. How am I going to get that item that was just digitized into this? And you can start very simply. Start if you want to start with the item that was just scanned. How do we get that thing that we just digitized? How do we get that into this software? And that can be the start of building your very first process documentation. And then from there you can kind of expand and you can keep going. Certainly once you get to the point where you're kind of getting ready to go live, we've decided on the software, we've gotten up and running, we've designed it, it looks good, we've got the name, we've done most of the basic configurations and customization we'd want to roll it out. And we've done our testing, so we're ready. We've got some workflows in place. We know how to add an item. We know how to delete an item. We know how to fix a typo. We know how to add some subject headings. We know what kinds of subject headings we're going to add. You've talked about the metadata schema, so we know all of that. Then you're kind of ready to think about content, really content curation at that point. So you're really at that point of really thinking about how do we ramp this up? Like how do we move this from this person testing it and adding one thing and doing the work? How do we turn that into an actual process? How do we ramp this up? And you may or may not really have a way to ramp it up. If you're the only and you're doing all of this by yourself, and you're going to be the only person digitizing, you're the only person cataloging, you're the only person loading content, then certainly your content curation process is, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And if I see a better way, I'll figure it out. If you are thinking that, well, I'm going to have some help digitizing, I'm going to have some student workers, or I already have student workers who are digitizing, there may be opportunities for them to help you in some way. Can they upload files to this? Is there a way that I can give them a user account so that they can do some things without maybe deleting? Maybe I want them to be able to go in and edit a record, but I don't want them to delete. Or maybe I want them to add files, but not be able to delete, whatever it is. So, it's time for you to then talk about curation. Certainly as you move into production, you're going to talk more about what the user experience is, the UX, what's the user experience. Maybe do some usability testing with your public at that point. Start thinking about statistics, reporting, public, PR, all that kind of stuff. How do we let people know about this cool thing that we're building? And then of course thinking about kind of going forward, how are we sort of next steps? If we are digitizing things from the community or the campus, and maybe we don't know who all the people are. We have especially photographs. This is so common with photographs and video. We don't know who all the people are. We can certainly, if it's your campus, then you may, or your town, you may very well recognize the places and recognize the locations of things. So the places may not be as much of an issue as identifying the people or even the time period in some cases. Usually with photographs and other visual content, you can often get a good sense of the date from the style that something's done in, or the type of clothing people are wearing, the hairstyles, the cars behind them. There's all those kinds of things that will sometimes give you a hint in terms of what date you're looking for. But identifying people, a lot of times we just don't know unless somebody tells us. So that can be a little bit of a tricky thing. I think one of the I always thought this was one of the neatest parts of this archives and repository project is that it's not happened yet because they're still working on it, but the goal is that when they get enough of the older photographs on there, and they also have some oral archives and stuff. In the oral archives, they do know who those people are, but once they get the photographs, more of the photographs up, they want to ask the alumni and ask the community members, do you know people in these photographs, and push it out on social media. So there's some PR work that can happen, and we all love looking at old photographs, I think. And so it's a win-win. You get information hopefully on who the people are, and then on top of that, uh, you you know they get to see something, and you get that PR, and you get your numbers coming up and things like that. Harvesting from other collections, enhancing your workflows, and then of course making sure that you have those backups and upgrades in place. I've kind of snipped this out I found a few different kinds of diagrams in terms of how these, including mine that's not quite as pretty as this, but how these sort of projects work. And this was a Dspace, and we're going to look at Dspace in just a little bit. But you have what they have, their collections. They have sort of these big collections that they have communities, and then they have sub communities, and then they have collections where the items actually live. So they're organized in a little bit different way, but they're always grouped in some kind of grouping, regardless if they call it a community or sub-community or collection or whatever. But the individual items are always organized in some type of grouping. And that is true regardless what kind of process you're looking at. This is I found this one yesterday, and I just thought this was the most awesome, even though it doesn't give a lot of information to us in terms of sort of the internal workflows. I do think it does give a pretty good, and I'm going to just point out a few things here. So if you look down here, and you'll have these, and I tried to make this as big as I could since I was pulling this from somebody else, but it really does give you a lot of information about like what happens when a person, in this case we're looking at really Dspace, so it could be you're uploading the record, so you're the one submitting it. It could be that you're working on, I know Dspace has been used for a lot of electronic theses and dissertations, and so in some cases they have a student or faculty member, or like the graduate school is the one submitting it. And so, it's kind of neat that I think this is just kind of a neat example where it kind of takes you through this and kind of puts it in a sort of Legos and pipes approach to kind of explain how these pieces fit together. And I really do like this graphic. So I do think if you are trying to communicate to people sort of how the software works from sort of a big picture kind of thing, that this diagram might be a very useful thing to share to people. And especially if you're talking to administrators, or you're talking to other people in your community, or outside the library, or even other people in the library who maybe are not as technologically savvy as some may be. I do think that this diagram can, with some explanation, because it is a little bit kind of you have functional preservation and metadata, and it's a little bit terminology heavy, but I do like the diagram, and I think it can be a useful tool to kind of explain to people how it works. This is one that I came up with. You can see it's very simple, very, very simple, to try to explain to some of the grant participants that I was working with sort of what was happening. So, how does this all fit together? We start out with the website, and then what happens? How were they going to get stuff into that repository? The grant people who had to submit things to it. And what was going to happen when they submitted that information? And then, of course, oh, you say there's a database on the back end, and this is all stored in the database. Well, how does that work? And so to try to give them a little bit of information about how that process works. And certainly, again, you're more than free to share my little diagram. It's not the prettiest, and actually it seems to get skewed sometimes. So just to kind of talk just a little bit, kind of hit some things we might not have hit in terms of plan details. You will want to, when you're looking at your software analysis and review, one of the things that I like to do that I feel is very helpful is come up with a shopping list. And I will share one of my shopping lists with you, sort of an example of it. My shopping list, what I will usually do with a shopping list is once I pull together a shopping list, and the shopping list is these are the things that we must have. Now it depends on your project. So when I worked on one grant project, the 3 parts of the grant mandate, anything that we created must be open. Well, that meant we couldn't use commercial software because even though we didn't create it, anything we used in that project had to be open. So, okay, we had to use open source software. Well, there's half of our choice or a third of our choice right there. We have to use open source software. So that has to go on our shopping list. Top of the list must be open source. Second thing on the shopping list, because the grant says it must support Creative Commons licensing because that's a grant mandate. All right, that's number 2 on the shopping list. It must support that, or we must be able to build it in some way. Third thing on the list was that it needed to be able to archive and to have a database or some sort of file structure behind it to actually hold files. So it had to be able to hold files and serve as an archive. And then the fourth thing, which although was not a requirement of the grant in terms of the software, it was a requirement of the grant as a whole, and the software actually made it happen. And that was that anything that was created under that grant had to go into a national repository. And since the software we used, we ended up using Omeka, and I'll talk a little bit about why. The software we used allowed that harvesting from Omeka to a Dspace installation. So the national grant was a Dspace installation. So, that's the kind of thing where it was like and it had to be accessible. So really, really the 5 things. But, there's a lot of things on there that Creative Commons licensing, that might not be an issue for somebody else. But for this grant mandate, it was. Grant mandate said open technology, so that meant it had to be open source. So, that's one of those things of what's on your shopping list for what you need in terms of looking at software is not going to necessarily be the same as everybody else's. You may have very specific needs, and we'll talk just a little bit about those as we are looking at software. The other thing I think that's really useful to come up with sort of during this time period is really looking at a resource list. What resources are available to you? Do you have any money? Did you get a grant? Certainly you can talk about grants for the future, but do you have money right now? And what money do you have? Or if you don't have a budget, and you don't necessarily have to have a budget, but if you don't have a budget, but if you do have well, we'll find money if you need money. I mean, sometimes we hear that in libraries, or we'll find some way for that. So at least knowing that there's some funding for it and what that funding could be used for. Then, of course, you're going to want to figure out how you're going to test this software, whatever you choose. So you're going to need some kind of server to put it on. Or if you're contracting with a company, if you have money to do that, then you may be having them host it for you and you just get a login. So, there's a few different ways you can get around that. But again, there's that resource list. Do we have money to buy a server? Do we need a server? Or is there a server we can use? Well, we don't have money for a server and we don't have a server. Most libraries have a server someplace or on their campus or in their institution of some sort. But it may be that you have to look, to see what system or citywide or townwide or whatever, what resources you have. So if your website is hosted by the city or your website is hosted by the university, as opposed to being hosted at your your own library, then it may be that that's the person you're going to talk to see if there's a server that you can use temporarily for testing, but that you're going to need to talk about a server going forward. If you're told, I'm sorry, there's no server, we don't have that, then that's something you're going to have to talk about on your resource list. Are we going to purchase a server? Are we going to work with a company, maybe a local company, to host this product for us on their own server? Or are we going to maybe go with one of the larger companies and have them host for us? So, there's some choices there, but you're going to need that. That's sort of a have to have thing. Software and installation. I think it is a good time to start talking about a controlled vocabulary. Also talk about what your information architecture is going to be. You can certainly put an information architecture or things like the menus, categories, collection names, things we sometimes don't think about just sort of off the bat. I don't think you have to have this completely set in stone now. I think you can come up with your basic information architecture. This is where what they call wireframing, where you just kind of draw out, kind of like this is what we'd like it to look like. Sometimes people start out with them on a flip chart or a whiteboard. I've worked on a lot of projects where we whiteboarded this, and in some cases we started with the list. In other cases we drew like a little map, website markup, and went with that. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I think it's a good time to be talking about it, because when you start, when the software starts getting installed, these things are going to come up like, oh, where are we going to put this stuff? What's the collection name? That kind of stuff. And then I think it's good to kind of think about what the metadata schema is. I don't know that you need to have to decide it right at this point, but you're going to need to decide at some point. I don't think it's too early to talk about design and branding. You may know that up front. You may have your school colors. Yay, yay, we're going to be blue and gold. Everything's blue and gold. You may know that up front. So, test, test, and test. You may need to train the people who are testing. Then you're going to start looking at your workflows, and really we talked a little bit about the workflows already, thinking about what templates you could develop to help you. A little bit on the cataloging details, just because that's sort of my bread and butter. Talking about your metadata schemas, and then whether or not you're going to try to work with your ILS or work with any discovery tool that you have on your library website. How is this going to fit into your library website? So where are you going to put it, and how are people going to find it? How are they going to access it? Can you somehow have your website search a repository at the same time it searches the library catalog? That's one thing that would be awesome if that could do. If you have a discovery service like Summons or Primo, something like that, that may already do it. You just may need to tell them, hey, we have this new thing. If not, then you may have a Google search, and maybe you just need to add that URL in when you get to the point of wanting to push it out. Or it may be that you want to talk about loading records from one to the other, crosswalking those records. That can be a big project, but that may be something to think about. How to batch load and edit. Can you do this? So where are you going to get your data from? This is really that cataloging, very specific stuff of where are you going to get information from. In some cases, people like to use Google Forms or some kind of web form to collect data. A lot of times you'll see this with sort of institutional repository or like electronic thesis projects, where they'll have the student or somebody fill out a web form, and then it goes over to someone to check, and then it goes into a repository, or whatever workflow set up. Harvesting from other repositories, there's tools you can do that. You just need to decide kind of, do we want to do it? We don't have to do it now, but can we do it? And then, of course, we already talked about MARC records. Do you want to do anything with them? Do you need to do anything with them? Is that something that needs to go on your shopping list? It doesn't, just because you put something on your shopping list does not mean you have to do it on day one. It can be, we need this functionality, but this is not going to be the first thing we work on. First, we're going to digitize and get all of our photographs in there. but we want to make sure that we can support this as we're going forward and working on things. Talking about what metadata schema that you want to use, there's some real cataloging discussions to be had there. What rights you may need to be able to state to people, and I do think it would be really awesome if we could see more rights statements on library content, just because I do think it can be useful. And then, of course, how are you going to actually get that metadata, that information into your digital library? Not just into your library, I guess I should clarify, into your digital library. Are you going to manually, individually upload a file, edit the record, save, move on? You're going to use spreadsheets. You're going to do that mapping for MARC. Um, and all of that kind of stuff. And then your typical subject analysis and things like that. So this is the spreadsheet that I was talking about earlier, where I was looking at comparing the types of, and I call this learning object because at the time we were going back and forth about whether or not we're going to call this a learning object repository, since we knew we had multimedia, or a digital library, or an institutional repository. And so we kind of went with archives and electronic resources repository. So a little bit of a hodgepodge, but really it's all kind of the same. So looking at the software, and then, you know, for each one, I came up with a brief description. And Avalon and Hydra, I'll talk just a tiny bit about those. We're going to look just a little bit about Avalon, so we'll talk just a little bit about that. There is an MLS grant right now that's looking at developing Avalon more. And so Hydra is what they call a fork of, or I'm sorry, Avalon is a fork of Hydra. So Hydra is kind of the base of where this software came from. And then Avalon was, a group was looking at how they could take Hydra and really develop it for multimedia. So, you know, that's one of the things to be thinking about when you're writing your shopping list, is what kind of content you have, what kind of content you think you're going to get. Of course, that's a little bit of future crystal ball gazing, but you know, what kind of metadata you think you're going to have, and then sort of looking at what software supports. So in the case of when I was looking at this software to try to make a decision for a lot of multimedia content, Avalon was still very early in development. It was also Ruby on Rails, and we did not at that time have, at least in the 3 institutions I was working with on that project, did not have Ruby on Rails support. We had quite a depth of MySQL and quite a depth of PHP expertise, and then some HTML, CSS kind of expertise overall. So in addition to some other like SAS and other data sorts of stuff. So we had a lot of expertise, but we did not really have a strong community of Ruby on Rails developers, either in the student population or in the faculty staff population. So although Avalon is open source, it just at the time felt like we were not going to have the resources really to be able to participate in that project, or to be able to really successfully undergo it. But I'll have to say, I really like the way it looked, and I think there's some really good stuff there. So I'm hoping that there'll be more of what they call turnkey. Turnkey meaning that you have usually one file package, and you just sort of, it comes with an installer, and it just kind of installs the whole thing and sort of sets up a basic site for you with some very basic information that you do through like the self-installer script kind of thing. So basically, it's kind of like with WordPress. It's one push publishing kind of stuff, where you just download it, install it, and it just magically does everything you need to get started. And then you go in and you add your, you know, the name of your site and all that kind of stuff. Pick your theme and that kind of stuff. So I think if they can get to that point, and they may be closer now, but if they could get to that point, I think that that would really make that project take off, because it does work with a lot of multimedia, and is very beautiful in its presentation. And I'll show you guys a screenshot of that in just a second. Hydra, like I said, that's a little bit, it's more back end and it's just not as, I think development seems like it's really been pushed into Avalon now. Dspace is very popular repository software. It's been used by the University System of Georgia here in the state of Georgia. They are moving away from it, but it has been used for years. It was traditionally a repository for text-based documents, and I think you can really see that when you look at it. One of the things we were looking at with the learning objects was looking at whether or not they supported SCORM, and SCORM is a sort of a metadata schema that wraps around learning objects that addresses accessibility. And some of the other sort of unique things about a learning object being a package of things that frequently are multimedia, and sometimes they can be, so you might have like a PowerPoint presentation from a faculty member, you might have a quiz, you might have some class notes or handouts, kind of thinking about even like when all the stuff gets loaded to SEFLIN, that could all be packaged together as one package as the digital library landscape package. And so you kind of get everything wrapped together, but it would have this SCORM wrapper on the outside that would explain to the repository how to display all those pieces and make sure they're all linked together and stuff. So that's a very brief description of SCORM, but it's something that it has not gotten the wide acceptance of support that I think some of the other metadata protocols and standards have gotten, and I'm not really sure why, except it seems like one of those things that started out with a good intent and then it's just had a lot of uncertainty, I guess is a good way to put it. Drupal, many of you may have heard of Drupal. It is a website publishing platform. You can use it to build pretty much anything. It can be built into a learning management system, and I will say as a default installation, that turnkey out of the box, it works more as a traditional website or repository with a discussion forum. It has a good discussion forum support, but it doesn't have really, in terms of like a learning management system, it doesn't really have options or building a gradebook or a class space. Although there are attempts, there are some projects to do that. Drupal, I think, is a little more development heavy, and I would say if you're going to go down the road of Drupal, even though, so Dspace, Drupal, Avalon, these are all open source products, which means they're free to use. I will say that Drupal and Dspace require, at least from my experience, it seems like they require a little bit more in terms of some web development support. Same thing with Fedora Commons. My experience in using Fedora Commons is that it was, the front end of it felt very skeletal, and it really feels like, at least to me at the time that I was experimenting with Fedora, it felt like you really needed to, if you're going to use Fedora, Islandora seems to be a better choice, which is Drupal on the front for sort of that pretty web interface, and then Fedora kind of running the back end of it. Omeka, Omeka was a really nice repository, and that's what I've used Dspace and Fedora and Omeka, and then getting into some ArchivesSpace stuff. But Omeka was a really nice repository interface and works beautifully for multimedia. So I'll talk more about that. So as you see here, so I came up with a description for each of them, and then I went through the system requirements, which I just pulled off the website, because the other thing was I needed to make sure that these system requirements would pass the IT director. And so, that's one of the things too, that you may find software that you think, wow, this is the most awesome software ever. Yes, I need to use this. And then when you look at the system requirements, you may either find, like with Ruby on Rails, oh, we don't have anybody on campus who really can, or anybody in this library or the system who can really help me with Ruby on Rails. So I don't know about that. Or you may find that there's something, something that's listed as a requirement, and your IT folks may say, nope, 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 not going to work. So, that's one of the things to kind of think about. So anyway, this is available to you. You can use it. You can use it for inspiration. You can use it and repurpose it for what you need. Feel free to do what you want to with it. So I want to talk a little bit and look at the sort of the biggies that we've talked about. ArchivesSpace. ArchivesSpace really is coming out of Archivist Toolkit. And so it has a really strong focus on creating those finding aids and making those finding aids searchable. And, I think because of that, there's still some it's really interesting. It seems like to me that some of the projects that work the best in terms of sort of the cataloging part of it, in terms of the metadata, in terms of being able to search and retrieve things and be able to put information in there. It seems like you get functional or pretty. But sometimes I feel like you don't get both. But anyway, ArchivesSpace is certainly coming along, and I think that we're going to continue to see a lot of development. I know that there are several partners for ArchivesSpace. Lyrasis here in the Southeast is partnered with ArchivesSpace. So there's a lot of support for ArchivesSpace, and Archivist Toolkit was certainly an excellent project. So I do think we're going to start seeing a little bit more, and I want to show you I just grabbed a few screenshots of each of them so you could kind of see what the interface looks like. And I think the other thing to me that's always interesting is that even though the information can be different and what they call them can be different, there's so much commonality in sort of the interfaces of these, I think. I think it's just the nature of this kind of work. We want to be able to create records. We want to be able to find records. We want to be able to edit the records, all that kind of stuff. So, this is just scanning through and looking at a university archives. We have some subjects here on the left. What finding aids do we have associated with those subjects? What types do we have in this repository? And then, of course, in this particular repository, we have sort of those two big buckets of repositories. One of the things I think, and of course, then we have our digital objects and all of that kind of thing. It's one of these things of you either like a really clean, simple interface, or you want something that has a lot more in terms of graphical appearance, because this is certainly a very robust system, and I know that there's a lot that can be done with it. The other part of it is it does work with other metadata schemas and things like that, so it gives you a lot of choice in terms of what you're doing with it. And really it's meant to be the focus right now, and I know it's starting to expand a little bit more. So it's one of those things where, just like with WordPress, when WordPress first started out, WordPress was a very much just blog software. If you downloaded WordPress and installed it, all you could really do was create a blog. So, it was like chronological order, top to bottom kind of thing. And it was just that, a list by date. You didn't have categories and all those things. And of course, now people are creating whole websites and shopping carts and shopping websites and all kinds of things in WordPress. Libraries are creating their whole website in WordPress. So I do think that as some of these softwares that are out there become like Avalon and ArchivesSpace, as we use them more and we push the boundaries of what they can do, uh, and if you have somebody who is very good at that development, that web development, systems development stuff, they can push these systems to do way more than what they do out of the box. And so I do think that's one of the things to kind of think about when you're thinking about your resources is, really, really what's in there. And, like I said, it was originally meant really to support finding aids. This is a Dspace form in terms of how you add somebody, describe an item. You see at the top, you've got describe, access, upload. You've got the place for the Creative Commons license. So you've got that. You've got a place for a different license. So this is a form that has been a little bit customized. You have some information where you can look up names and things like that. So there is those quality control checkpoints in some of these. I will say this in terms of authority control, in terms of names, whether linking names and things like that. Some systems do this a lot better than other systems, and that just it's going to depend upon really what your needs are and to what extent you need that authority control. You may choose to go with a system that doesn't maybe have as robust ability to control the names as something like Dspace or ArchivesSpace would have, because you have more multimedia and you want more of that, you want more of the pretty, without having to have a lot of programming experience. So, that may be one of the things you have to put in your pros and cons in your shopping list, is like, we'd like to have this, but we have to have this. And so there's that functionality sometimes, like I said, the trade-off between pretty and functional. This is the front end of a Dspace installation. This is Skills Common, which Skill Common is that when I was talking about the national repository. So this is a repository of educational content from all of the different participants in this grant. In some cases, the grant participants don't have very much. In other cases, they have a whole lot. But anyway, you see here it has the upload, the TAACCCT, educational resources. So there's how people contribute. Certainly there's information about communities and things like that. But so they've given it a pretty front end. And then when you actually go in and look at the content, so this is just searching for an institution. And, you just get kind of a regular, sort of a very Google-esque search result here. Not bad, but just a regular search. And of course, this is coming from the information that is coming from that metadata that they've put in. And, so that's one of the things that you may think about too, is sort of, what is it that we want? Is this okay? Is this sort of search result where you just get a list and that's kind of the information that you see? Or, do we really want something that has an embedded player that we can put multimedia in, or that has embedded players and things like that? And in some cases, you may be able, through plugins and web development and customization, you may be able to do some of this sort of stuff within these systems like Dspace and some of these other systems. It just may require a little bit more work on your end or the web development end or whoever's helping you. If you're outsourcing this kind of project, the web development aspect of it, the more you ask of special things, one, the more expensive it's going to get, and two, the harder it's going to be when you get ready to upgrade or migrate. So, this is the same resources. So we're actually going to look at exactly the same resource we looked in the that Dspace installation, so you can see what it looks like. And the focus here was we really wanted something that was very pretty. So this is a slideshow. It's kind of cut off down here, but this is a slideshow that rotates along. And of course, if you click on any of these images, it takes you right to that photograph and to its metadata. Of course, we created all our little links up here, and this is just a Google search up here. This is the Omeka software. This is not what Omeka looks like coming out of the box. This is pretty significant customization. So again, and this is one of my projects. So again, this is the kind of thing that if you have the staffing time, or you have the, this is a necessity for us, we really want this, then that's something you're either going to focus on, or you're going to be asked to focus on. So for example, one of the things that we were asked was, and this was on they had a student summer camp kind of thing, the engineering technology program, and the faculty were helping the students, and they were doing some things with balloons and measuring the wind, and I don't remember all the things they were doing now, but anyway, one of the things they wanted was the ability to actually see the photographs within the repository, so you don't have to click on anything. Certainly when you're at the main page, you can click on the slideshows, and that will take you, each institution has their page, and then you can go in and you can look at the content that's in the slideshow. There are at times There will be documents in there, but the documents all have a screenshot, so it's not just like a little plain document kind of thing. So it was a little bit of work, and it's a little bit of work to upload each one of these because this really is that manual cataloging process. Now all of this stuff happens automatically. So this was all stuff, and this is stuff that was built through using plugins, freely available plugins to extend the capability. And so that's the other thing too, as you're looking at these different softwares out there, there may be, if you start looking in places like GitHub, I don't know how many of you are familiar with GitHub, but GitHub is this huge repository, and there are libraries in GitHub. There are library programmers in GitHub, web developers who work for libraries in GitHub, all kinds of people in GitHub. And GitHub is this place where people share software, and not only do they share software, they share things like plugins and modules that they create for software that they're using or their library's using. Now, because of the fact that in this particular project, this was a grant-funded project and everything is mandated to be open, so everything that was created for this project, including all the templates and themes, are released under an open license. So those actually, there is a copy of all the templates and themes that create this, as well as documentation for all of the plugins and modules that were used to build this site. And there's a lot of them. To make it pretty, there were a lot of them. That's all documented in the repository. And it's also in some of the resources that I'll share. So, some of the things are things that people really wanted for the pretty. This is one of those things where you can expand and, make the zoom in on the photograph and things like that, and bookmark the photo. And then you have your traditional, just Dublin core, just your traditional Dublin core metadata cataloging stuff down here. So, in that way, we really wanted to be able to capture the multimedia. And, for photographs, it's nice, I think. When we got to the yearbooks, so the yearbooks went into a separate collection. When we got to the yearbooks, we actually used the Internet Archive book flipbook. So this is what, remember, here's our photograph in the repository, and this is just the top half of it. So of course the metadata goes, there's subject headings and all that stuff down at the bottom. I just snipped out the top so you could kind of see the visual presentation of it. But, that's one bit of metadata in one site. And this is the same bit of metadata in a different site. And, in terms of presentation of information, the information is the same. It really captures everything here. Now, some of our Library of Congress subject headings have gotten kind of squished up and kind of look strange. They're also not hot linkable. So, if you're in this Dspace installation and you want to be able to click on any of the stuff that's down here at the bottom, the subjects, while they are indexable, you cannot click on them and do anything with them. Whereas in the other installation, you can. So, there's a lot of different pieces in terms of what the user experience is and what your community might need. This is sort of the back end of it, so you can kind of see the Dublin core part of it. I think it's a pretty simplified, it's a lengthy form because it's 4 parts, and I'm not going to go into all 4 parts, but essentially as someone who's cataloging from a manual perspective, you start out with the add an item. Of course, you have to have your collection created first, add an item, and then you're just going to go through and you choose what fields you're going to fill in. And there's that metadata schema that you have to kind of figure out, like what's going to be required. Does everything we put into this repository, must it all have a title and description? You may think no or yes. That's kind of your decision. And then if you choose the use HTML, it will hot link items if possible. The other thing is then it goes on to item type metadata that gives you information about what the file format is and all that kind of stuff. Again, pretty lengthy. And then you finally get to the spot where you're going to get some information. You can see if you've already attached a file. So if you needed to add multiple files, there is a way to batch add files too. But if you were to want to go back and add another file to a particular item, you could do it here. And then it does support, and this is another plugin. So, you know, really you do have to look at plugins when you start building these sorts of things. But, you know, did we want to have tags? And in this case, we did, because we also use tags in terms of our searching. It was another way for us to key in on those institutional names. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about what you're doing when you're building an institutional repository or digital library, really what the needs of your community are, what kinds of materials you have. And actually, when we started this process, because we were thinking this was really going to have a lot of material from the engineering technology department and emerging technologies, which are kind of right there tied together. We really thought, because we were starting to get into virtual reality, we were really thinking that we're going to get a lot of virtual reality and 3D digital movies, because we have cameras. You know, that was one of the things they bought with the grant, was like the 3D digital cameras and some of the virtual reality headsets and the development kits and things like that. So we really thought we would have a lot more of those sorts of things. And then, of course, the 3D printers. Now, what we ended up having was some of the plans and the things that were developed using the 3D printers, mostly um, you know, little animals and things like that. But things that people had created using 3D modeling software as examples of work. And so those all went in here. So we really thought we were going to have a lot more 3D, and we just did not have as much 3D as we originally thought we might. And part of that is it just takes so long to do that 3D development and 3D work. The other thing I discovered in the process of kind of working on this is that the standards for 3D development and virtual reality file formats, and also in terms of metadata schemas, are very much in the evolution phase. And then finally, the other thing was, you know, we saw the viewer for the photograph, where it just shows you the photograph. We also have the embedded viewer for the movies, and we also have embedded viewers for documents. So if you want to look at a document, you can just, from the website, when you get there, you can just scroll on it. And you can also download it. And we also provide, of course, for the video transcription to meet that accessibility requirement. And for the 3D digital virtual reality stuff, you know, the best we can do, like with the photograph, is really just provide a description to people, because there's not really a way we can do much more than that. But you know, finding a viewer that would meet that need of having that, how do you take that 3D digital object file format and to be able to turn it into something and have to find a viewer that will display it. And of course, then, because that is such an evolving platform, not only for the file format, but in terms of what the various browsers that people might use, the devices they might be using to access it, you know, then thinking about making sure that we put disclaimers and things like that, so that, or some bits of information on it. So if people couldn't view it, they would know what it was, and also give them some information about where they could go to get a viewer if they needed to. We did the best we could in terms of building a viewer for those, but you know, with those emerging file formats, it just becomes a little bit more complicated. So that's the other part of it that I think sometimes is the unanticipated part of working with digital objects and digital library material. Certainly if you're working with traditional formats like photographs, or you're working with even video, although video has its own little issues. But if you're working with more of a traditional file format like a PDF or a text file, or you're working with a photograph, then you know, the information that you're able to collect, the viewers that you're able to use, the kind of information you're able to present to people are pretty much fairly well established in terms of what's out there. The other thing that happens is you can just have weird glitchy things that happen sometimes, and this is a display. We could never seem to figure this out. So if you went and actually looked at the website, there would not be two. But then for some reason you would just see sort of this this odd repeat thing that would happen. One of the nice things that I always liked about Omeka is that if you look over here on the side, so as a person who's cataloging, has the cataloging rights to do that, one of the things that I liked that I thought was just so nice is that there's this very nice view public page. So, when you're doing your work, if you need to make a change, you can just click on edit and then you can go in and do whatever you need. And then you, of course, save it. Once you edit, it'll come up with a little save button up here, and then you would save it. And then you can flip right over to the public page and you can see what the public page looks like. Of course, it has the roles and all that kinds of information and things like that. See over here on the side, these are some of the plugins that are loaded. The plugins that have the more funky names, that's probably the easiest way to explain it. The things that have the more funky names like embedded items, U2 import, Sotera, those have a tendency, almost all of those, simple vocab, those are all things that are things that I loaded in. So, and then Elsie suggests for those of you who might have done some cataloging work or have done some, Dublin core work where you want to assign a Library of Congress subject heading, do look for, if you're already using a repository software, do you go out and look for some of these plugins, because you may very well find that there is one for the software that you're currently using if you are using one. So Elsie suggests does this great little thing where when you start typing a subject, and in this case we're supporting FAST, so other than a couple of local authorities sorts of things we've created, we're supporting FAST. So you can start typing and it will go out and query against the Library of Congress subject headings that have been published as linked data, and it will then finish out with the appropriate phrase. So it's a little bit of a checkpoint. The other part of it that I think is really nice too is that you can batch add. And so, for example, we could kind of group photographs together and batch import a group of photographs together. And we could say, okay, this group of photographs here, we know these are all students and they're all studying, or they're all in lab or whatever, or these are all nursing students or whatever. So we could kind of group students together and assign some basic subject headings to get started. So this one is not quite finished. We would do more subject headings, but it's started. We got it started with some stuff. So it's sort of a multi approach. And for those of you who catalog, it's gonna take a while. So again, this is sort of the front end, just to kind of show you what the front end looks like. There's so many different ways you can present information, and it really is just about finding what works for you. And you remember we looked at Avalon there just a minute and saw that sort of embedded video and what that looked like. This is sort of an example of the front page of what Avalon can look like. So again, it looks very similar to what we came up with at Omeka, where you have some featured content on the front, a little bit of information about it, and the search box and things like that. So there's a lot of different approaches to this kinds of material. You can go with something that's a little more text-based like Dspace, and then put a pretty sort of front end on the front of it. Again, you might need some development help. And the reason why Avalon was developed, I thought this was kind of a nice little thing, although they didn't include Omeka in here, because Omeka does work well with media. But it is true that Dspace and Fedora, Digital Commons, and Content DM have not traditionally worked well with media, and especially with streaming media. Streaming media is a huge concern if you're really looking at some of these projects and you're thinking about hosting media and you're thinking about streaming media. So using something like Kaltura. So if you're really looking at something that is going to work with your learning management system, that's going to work with what your faculty are doing in terms of being able to do like virtual class space and the kinds of stuff we do here, Avalon certainly would work with it, and I think Omeka would work to it with some modification because I do know it'll work with Kaltura. But in terms of some of the others, it's more of a traditional static repository where you upload something and people can go and download it, but that's really about it. In terms of sort of those traditional content management systems, uh, good old Drupal. It still kicks around. This is a screenshot from Drupal 6, and they're on 8 something now. I forgot what I just upgraded my website to. But anyway, the interface, this is Garland, which is, see, I even know the name of this theme. It has been around for so many years and has changed names a little bit. And if you love the look of this theme, and of course you can put your own icon up there and everything now, but if you love the look of this theme, there's even a version of this for WordPress now, because this theme has been kicking around in the Drupal landscape for so long. But it's I think people probably have a love-hate relationship with it because we've all seen it so much if you use Drupal. So Drupal has a tendency to, you can do a lot with it. You can also do a lot with WordPress. I do know that there are sites that are pairing WordPress with traditional repository software. So I talked about NC Live earlier, and NC Live being an Aquella site. But on the front end, they've put WordPress on it. So they've got the repository software running on the back end. And then to give that really pretty, nice sort of user interface that so many of us appreciate and love, they've put WordPress on the front of it. Now, you may not have development time or energy to do that kind of thing. The nice thing about Islandora that I talked about just a few minutes ago, the nice thing about Islandora is it does come packaged together. You do need to be able to have that Fedora support and to be able to have support for Fedora and Drupal, because it is those two items put together, but it does come pre-packaged together. And so that's a really nice thing with Islandora, that you get all of that strength of functionality of Fedora behind it, all of that strong searching, that strong support for metadata, all of that stuff, and then you get the pretty of Drupal. I will say this, in terms of website development, content management development, sort of ease of development, WordPress is certainly going to be much easier if you're doing an in-house shop, unless you have a web designer or web developer or somebody who's very keen to take this on. Drupal does require a little bit more building. So although this is kind of like, and actually, unless they've changed it, the White House website, whitehouse.gov website, until recently, I have to admit, I have not looked lately, until recently was a Drupal site. So, that's an example. You think about, sort of how big that site is, and you think about sort of the, all the different logos and graphics and the newspaper, all the papers and things like that they put on there. A lot of content, and how it's all organized so nicely, and all of that stuff. So, Drupal can be very pretty. I'm trying to think of some other sites that are big sites. That happens to be the one I was thinking of the most, because I know the White House staff at the time they were building Drupal were doing a lot of development for it too. But typically Drupal out of the box, it looks like this. It's it doesn't have to be blue. You can change the color, but it's sort of this structure, and a very simple website. And in order to be able to do some design work, you really do have to be able to go in and modify templates and things like that. It's gotten easier, but it still is not as easy as WordPress is. So, that's one of the things to think about when you think about your resources that are out there available. What resources do you have to make this happen? And not only to make it happen, you don't want just the metadata part of it, just the back end of it to be nice. I mean, certainly you do want the back end of it to be nice. But unless you're going to use some kind of discovery tool, like, you might use something like VU Find, or there's the paid sites like Summons and Primo and things like that. Unless you're going to have something else sit on top of it to sort of make it more user-friendly and more pretty, then I think you probably need to look at one of the softwares that can do that and how you're going to do that. Certainly, I thought this was really interesting that Princeton has been looking at how Drupal and Dspace can work together, which I thought was really an interesting project. So there's lots of partnerships that you can do where you take one of these more traditional sort of design, content management, website development um, softwares, and you sort of put that on top of it. And so there are a lot of opportunities for integration, but again, that may be more than you have resources for, because this is people time. There's no cost to use Dspace. There's no cost to use Drupal. To do all of this work here, that's people time. And so people time and web space. So it may be that you don't have the people time or the people expertise to be able to do those things. And so you may need to look for more of that turnkey approach, or you may want to just sort of say, well, you know what, out of the box, Islandora is good enough for us. You know, we can customize it. It looks pretty enough. It's good for us. Or we're going to work with Lyrasis or some other company, and we're going to work on ArchivesSpace, and that's going to feed into our discovery tool, and that's going to be great for us. Or you may look at something like Omeka and go, hey, gosh, that's really cool out of the box. I'm going to try that. It may not be as robust as we would want it to be in terms of the metadata, but I think I can make it work. So, there's sort of that, what do you need and what's the most important thing you need? What is on your shopping list that you need for these softwares? And I talked about a metadata schema. Again, this is publicly available, created under the grant. This is not the first one of these I've written, by the way. But sort of looking at, because we wanted to map to mark. So, sort of looking to how do you do that? How do you create those fields and things like that? Again, that may not be something that's relevant to your particular project, but it may be something that is, it may be something that when you just kind of need to think about and go, you know what, we don't need to worry about it. This is going to sit here. It's going to be, whatever kind of project it's going to be. Or you may go, well, you know what, we might want to put MARC records into this thing one day. Or we want to get MARC records out so that we can load them into our catalog. Or we want to have everything indexed in our discovery tool, and they say they need a MARC record or an XML record. And so I need to be able to get that. So, it may or may not be something that you need to do, but it is something that you probably need to think about. I do think it at least falls into that. So making a decision, sort of, thinking about how do you make that decision? I mean, I've talked all about like kind of how do you come up with that decision? Why do you choose? What do you choose? Well, you choose what meets your shopping list. Meets your shopping list the best, because I will say this right now, you're not going to get everything on your list. So, you let that go. But what are the most important things? And you see here grant criteria. What is the mandatory, I can't have this. Just like when you're buying a car or adopting a dog or finding whatever, looking for a job, whatever you're doing, you have those requirements of this has to be here or I'm not going to do that. Whatever it is. I will not have a dog that chases cats because I have a cat or whatever it may be. So, that's it. Once you figure out what's on your shopping list, what are the mandatory things you need? And you can note them as mandatory or whatever, however you want to do it. What are the mandatory things you need? Then you can look at that software with the eye towards, does it meet? And this takes out that emotional part of it too, I think. Does it meet my criteria? And then if it meets your criteria, then you can look at, do I have the resources to support this? Do I have the staffing? Am I going to be able to build it? Do I have any design help? Am I doing this all on my own? And if I am, do I have time to do the design help or time to do the installation? And if not, then how's this going to happen? So, once you get your mandatory, like this is what it has to do, then you can kind of figure out the rest of it. the other parts of it, then you can look at the additional features. You know, these are things that you really feel like it needs to have, or things that maybe aren't on your requirement list, but they're things that you feel are mandatory. So, you know, you must have an upload workflow and the ability to have private space to be able to hide those things that aren't cataloged, aren't reviewed yet. You may need to have a vetting process. You know, I'm going to upload this and somebody else is going to review that. So, you know, that's one of those things that you may need to figure out. Uh, where is this going to live on your website and how is it going to live? Is it going to be indexed somewhere else? Do you need it to have that public interface? And if so, what does the public interface out of the box look like? And how hard is it to customize it if you want to customize it? So all important kinds of things to think about as you go forward. More questions to kind of think about. See, I'm just full of questions. More questions to think about. You know, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but just can take these and sort of think about them as you go forward in terms of what you might be planning or in terms of what kinds of things you want to do. You know, really thinking about things like content, um, you know, software upgrades. Who's going to do that? Workflows. Really think about sustainability. And I think all of us in libraries know, even if we don't always document everything, we would like to document everything. Really thinking about the existing resources. Do you have any partners who's going to help you, and how are they going to help you? Do you have a budget, if any? I think one of the most critical things if you're doing a digital library repository project is what kind of format that you have. If you have only text format and you do not envision, the other thing is too, I will just say this, I think most software this day, the lifespan for, I would say, usable functionality, which means it meets our needs and we use it and it feels adequate at least. I know, like the C level, the C grade. It can go from an A or a B, somewhere A to B, you know, and then it'll, as it gets older and ages, you know, it might go down to a C. But you know, I think our functional lifespan for software these days is probably a 5 years is starting to push it. 7 years, and it's like Moore's law too, where it gets faster and faster and faster. 7 years is way too long. If you've been on something for 7 years, you probably feel like you've been on it for 700 years. You probably feel like there are things that you wish it could do that it didn't, and it's just never been able to do those things. And you may have been just kind of using it and making it work as best you could, because I think we do that a lot in libraries. But it may be time to kind of look at what's out there, because there are things like Avalon that are being developed. And if they can, you know, it is developed, and you can, if you have any Ruby on Rails experience, and there may be people who are developing installers or who haven't developed a self-installer. I haven't looked lately, but you know, there's a lot of projects and there's a lot of support behind that. Certainly there you have support here. You know, there's all the wealth of resources and things like that at SEFLIN and training and things like that. There's Lyrasis, who does all kinds of digitization, all kinds of other work, and they're working with ArchivesSpace. So there's a lot of resources, not only out there in the big scene, but also sort of regional and local. The other thing too is that there's a lot of user forums, and those can be really, really helpful. So we've talked about identifying your resources, and the other part of it, of course, is identifying what's in your collection and making sure that you own the rights to digitize it. And that's one of those things that can be hard to know sometimes. So, you know, sort of kind of as we close up here, my favorite thing to show people, if they haven't seen it before, is the MARC record, what it really looks like. And of course, this is just one stream of text, so it would not have all of the breaks here. The breaks are because of the PowerPoint. And I think this, for libraries, is both one of our greatest achievements and our greatest challenges. Because it's very hard to get that to map into something else. And I think that is a very a very challenging part of what we deal with on both sides. This is the world that we're coming from, many of us, and trying to think outside that scope, I think, can be sometimes a little bit challenging because there's information here that we would like to see reflected sometimes in these digital repository softwares. And sometimes you just find there's just not a place to put it. And so when you start looking at what we call mapping metadata, so you start looking at, okay, title to title is a pretty easy one. But you start looking at, well, I have a second author. Where am I going to stick that person? I have additional dates. Where am I going to stick that information? Then we don't feel, sometimes it's not as satisfying as what we might see in a MARC record, despite all of its uh, challenges. So on that note, I just want to leave you with 5 keys for success. Identify your resources, build a plan, and work the plan. Now, I'm not saying, so this is number 3, I'm not saying work the plan and don't make any adjustments. By golly, if something is not working, and this is true even if you are working in a repository software now, if you're seeing that things aren't working, if you already have a repository and it's up and working, then I think that you have the luxury of being able to spend a little bit of time looking and kind of really thinking about what you want to do, and while you're continuing to build your collection in your digital library. If you do not have that and it's like, oh, we need to get this stuff on the web, well, that may be a little more pressure to kind of move along a little more quickly. So you may not have as much luxury in terms of planning, but do identify your resources because this will help you and save you many headaches along the way. You may have partners in your community, you may have partners on campus. If you have a library school near you, or near Florida State, if you're near Valdosta State, I know there's some Florida area people. Well, that you guys are south, so those people will be way north of you. But there may be other library science students or other library science programs that, or museum study students that may be near you that could do a little internship or somehow help you out. There may be programmers, students studying computer science or programming or something like that who might be interested in helping you out in some ways. That's not to say it won't be some work to manage that kind of project if you're going to pull in a lot of people from outside the library and outside what your scope. But there are resources out there that might help you. One of the really cool things I saw one time was a marketing class did marketing plans for the library. So as part of their project, they looked at all the library materials on the website and came up with like full-on marketing plans. So they came up with not only like flyers, but like advertisements and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was awesome and free marketing stuff for the library. And of course, the students got a grade. The library got free marketing stuff. I mean, that was awesome. So, think about what resources are out there. And if you have a zero budget, then you get creative, and that can be a good thing. Be flexible. If something's not working, you know, see what you can do to make it better. Build in a cushion. Projects always take. If you're going to actually do a project like this, it always is going to take longer. I would say at least twice as long as what you think it's going to take. So I will have to admit I've been woefully bad about underestimating my time, and then I end up working like 18 hours a day to sometimes finish these sorts of projects. But I've gotten better about building in a cushion because the thing is something will go wrong or someone will take longer to do their part, and you won't have any control over that, and it will just slow things down. It may take longer if you buy software or hire people. That may take longer. So, building in that cushion will help you when you get to that part where you need it. Start your enhancements list. When people start asking for things or saying, can we, Lori, in your digitization, can we digitize this? I'd like to digitize that. I want to do this. Things may be outside the scope of this project, but you may think, well, I'll just start a list. And that can make people feel much more, you know, not only comfortable, but it can make them feel much more appreciated, and then what they're asking for is at least being documented. I keep a project list for some of the projects I work on. It's public, well, not publicly, but private public. So you have to know the URL to get to it. But anyway, that helps people kind of see that, yes, I'm working on projects and they are moving up the queue or they're moving off the list, things like that. And I add to it. So when people suggest things, I add to it. So on that note, thank you all very much. I don't know how cold it is in Florida, but it's been freezing. No snow, but it has been very, very cold, and I was ready for spring and had put up my tent.
Oh, Robin, thank you. Well, we're nice and well. It's been cool here the last couple of days. It almost feels like, I don't know, Tallahassee weather. I don't know. It's been very nice, and you know, it's been like 50s at night and gets up to like 75 in the daytime. It's nice. I know, I do too. And thank you so much. Thank you all. And we really appreciate you coming today. And we'll see Robin again soon.
Yes, I have one comment from Lori. So Lori says, we have content DM, which now I learn isn't good with streaming media. Do you think OCLC will ever bring that up to date? You know, that's a good question, and I think, so there's a little difference between streaming media. So if you just have media that you are, you know, you have the whole media file, and you're uploading that file to your server, like what will happen with this recording where the whole file goes up to the server, then that should be handled pretty well. But I have to agree, I've heard a lot of concerns expressed from some of the content DM users, you know, in terms of either the cost that they're starting to accumulate or some of the other issues. So it's going to be interesting for me to see what happens with content DM and how it grows, because we kind of have ArchivesSpace that's kind of coming along very quickly in the market. Avalon, with this huge IMLS grant, you know, really is funding really pushing things along on the multimedia side, and it does work with the streaming media. So does OCLC have other products for archives or some kind of repository? You know, I would have to look, because I'm really only familiar with content DM, and I do know of some experimental things, but I don't know where they are in the process. I think for OCLC, they've been so focused on you know, sort of the databases and the first search aspect, and then also, of course, the OCLC and the world share, so building our ILS. So, you know, sort of building those ILS, and those ILS products worked on, you know, focused on the MARC record. So that's a good question, Jesse. I'll take a look and see, but I don't know of anything off the top of my head that's not kind of an experimental thing. They've tried a few things over the years, and you know, it's been real interesting to kind of watch, because I do see that it may be kind of the maybe more the open source market. And I think that's the problem too, is that when you're talking about developing these softwares and then installing them, it does get pricey, because web development, and I will say this as, you know, a librarian and, you know, person who's done some web development and things like that, compared to what our colleagues get paid in the private sector. I mean, the salaries across the board, I don't care if you're in a public or private, or you're in Florida or Washington State or wherever you may be, across the board, our salaries are much lower compared to our colleagues doing very similar work to what we do in the private sector. And I'm not encouraging anybody to run away, because I think there's great benefits to working in the library. But, you know, that's part of why there's that expense, I think, is development is expensive. And what happens in the open source community is there's usually, like Omeka, that was started by an archive that is in California, and I'm trying to think of the name of it. But anyway, they started that project and started building it with their own staff there. And then other museums, primarily, that one really came out of the museums. But then, you know, as the libraries came into that space, then they started looking at supporting Dublin Core and some of those other things. So, I think that's one of the things that's why we see libraries in the open source community so much, is because we have the staffing and we have so much expertise. I mean, you all just amaze me. I mean, all of my colleagues just amaze me when I meet them, like how interesting and truly dedicated, and just their level of expertise they have. Just always in awe when I meet people. It's just amazing. But anyway, so we really have that. We have such an educated, talented workforce who doesn't get paid very well, but such a talented, educated workforce, and that is, so we really do have that brain power to go out and build these sorts of things. So, I think that's one of the reasons why you see libraries in the open source community so much. What I would like to see more of the academic libraries, at least, is that a lot of times when you work for an academic institution, especially if you work for a large research library, you will, yes, Jesse, I'll send out I'll send out the slides as soon as we're done here. But I think one of the other things that happens when you're at those large research libraries, a lot of times you have to sign these intellectual property and my ideas or their ideas kind of thing, and that gets really tricky when you're working in open source software then. And this conversation's come up in several of the IT groups that I kind of lurk on. It comes up just about every year of, well, I'm developing or I'm writing code for this. Can I share it on GitHub, or can I share it here? And so a lot of times you'll see web developers working in libraries who are sharing it in their own institutions, or maybe sharing it in like some kind of IT group or at a conference proceeding, but you just won't really see those sorts of things in GitHub. Now you will sometimes. So I will say, if you're working with institutional repository software or digital library software, I don't know about Content DM so much because I haven't, since that's an OCLC baby. I would have guessed there's probably not a lot of plugin and module development for that, just like with the Koala being a Pearson product. There's not a lot of development about plugins and things like that because so much of that support is on the Koala and Pearson side. We'll say this about Koala, it is very pricey. It does a lot of amazing things, but it's very pricey. So, it's one of those trade-offs. Do you pay for the support, or do you support it with your talent that you have? Really your sweat and talent that you have. And if you support it, then, it's as good as you develop it then. So it's a challenge. There's no easy answer on it. Well, on that note, did that answer everybody's questions? And if so, then I will go ahead and just shut us down for the day. And I appreciate you coming on such a lovely day.
Oh, thank you, Robin. It's been great. We really appreciate you coming. And thanks, Jess and Lori. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.